Good morning, everyone. I'm Cassidy Bruin, AIA New York State's Associate Director of Education. Welcome to the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment, Understanding and Preparing for Our Changing Climate webinar. We would like to thank NYSERDA for their support in presenting our program. Today's program will run until 1 p.m. with time for questions and answers. Before we begin, please put your name on your Zoom profile to help staff with attendance, mute your microphone, and turn off your video. You are encouraged to use the chat box feature at the bottom of your screen to post comments and submit questions. This program has been approved for 1 HSW/LUs. You are required to attend the entire program to receive these credits. Zoom and staff will track your attendance. In addition to tracking your attendance, you will be required to complete a CE evaluation at the conclusion of today's program. The evaluation link will be posted in the chat box at the conclusion of the program and emailed to you afterward. You must complete and return this evaluation by tomorrow, Thursday, May 2nd at noon Eastern Time. Again, please open your chat box to see the evaluation link at the end. We will report AIA member credits to the AIA, and non-members will receive a certificate of attendance. Next, you will see today's program disclaimers up on the screen. They are also sent to you previously in the program's Know Before You Go email. Here are today's learning objectives. Please take a moment to review them. And it's now my pleasure to turn the program over to our moderator, Nick Ratkovich. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassidy. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nick Ratkovich. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Architecture at the University of Buffalo. I was also one of the co-chairs of the building sector chapter of the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment. We want to thank you for joining us this afternoon on this webinar. We're really excited to share some of the different results. We have 4 fantastic presentations this afternoon providing an overview of the assessment and also some of the results from 3 of the chapters. So society and economy, human health and safety, and the buildings sector. As you'll hear, working on the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment has been a multi-year effort, and we're really pleased to be able to share with you, as one of the first audiences, some of the results this afternoon. That said, we do have a lot of information to fit into a 1-hour time slot, and we have 4 speakers, so we will be saving the discussion questions for the Q&A session at the end. And to that end, if you do have any questions, we ask that you please place them in the chat so that I can keep track of them and ask them of the speakers after they've had a chance to share their part of the assessment process. Also, just as Cassidy mentioned, and I've seen a couple people who are just joining us, please make sure that you stay muted and turn off your camera to preserve bandwidth. The webinar is being recorded by AIA New York State. So first up, we have Amanda Stevens, and Amanda or Cassidy, I don't know if you can let her start to share her slides. Amanda is a senior project manager in the environmental research program at the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, or NYSERDA. At NYSERDA, she manages the program's climate change impacts and adaptation research projects. She spearheaded the New York State Climate Change Impacts Assessment, which was released earlier this year, and why we're really all here today in this webinar. She's been at NYSERDA since 2006 and has a bachelor's degree in geology from Hartwick College. So Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon and for your interest in the assessment. So I will be talking first, just kind of give you an overview of what this is all about, how it came about, and then I'll talk to you a little bit about what information and what products are available for you to take a look at. So first of all, what is this? So this was really a scientific look into how climate change is affecting and will affect New York State's communities, ecosystems, infrastructure, pretty much every sector across the state we looked at. And it was focused on how the climate will change, how those changes will impact the state, and how we can prepare for those impacts. So it's really looking at the impacts of physical climate change and adaptation and resilience strategies. It didn't go into very much on sort of the greenhouse gas mitigation side of things, reduction. So there are places where we talk about that, but that's not the focus of the assessment. This assessment also did not develop or recommend policy. It was really, again, really a scientific look into what's out there, what's possible, and it's up to policymakers and decision makers and to take that information and act on it. So the goals of the assessment are, again, to document how climate change will affect the state, and then to foster informed decisions about climate resilience and preparedness. We really want to present this data information in ways to help all New Yorkers understand, plan, and act. And that's really what we're striving for here today. We want to help get this information out to those who are actually making decisions on a daily basis, and that includes all of you on this call. So the assessment was developed by a lot of folks. So NYSERDA coordinated it, but it was really a large number of people across the board from different backgrounds, different places in the state. We had each of the sector chapters was developed by a sector work group, and there were about 8 to 10 individuals on each work group. And then each of those had another 15, 20 advisors who helped with bringing some more perspectives and really helped develop those chapters as well. So it was a really large work that we put into this, and we really were happy to have a really diverse group of individuals and organizations involved in this. So can I trust it? I sure hope so. It was developed with credibility in mind. So we had national climate science experts. Again, we had members of really diverse communities and constituencies across the state. We had some other state folks involved, Indigenous communities, and even a couple of folks from Canada. So the technical report has been peer reviewed by experts in the field, and all of the assessment contains links, references to primary sources. So if anybody really wants to know where something came from, you can find that out. So some of the products that you can find, I'll go into here, but I'll just note that they're all available on the website for the assessment, and I'll have that URL at the end of the presentation. But please do feel free to just kind of just float around on the website and see what's there, because there's a lot. But the assessment does include up-to-date projections of the future climate conditions in New York, and those were developed by Columbia University for the assessment. A peer-reviewed technical report on the climate change impacts across 8 sectors, and those sectors you can see here on the right. Each chapter includes discussion of adaptation strategies as well as case studies. And there are a lot of accompanying communication materials for various audiences that have been developed and some that are also still in development now. It is important to note that there is a building specific chapter, which I'm sure a lot of you are really interested in today. But I want to note that there are a lot of interconnections among sectors that are really important to consider. So we're going to get into some of those today. That's why we have some of the great folks on the call that we do. The projections themselves, so they include some of the things that if you are aware of our previous assessment, which was called CliMaid, that came out about 2011, that included projections as well. Things like average temperature and precipitation. This time around, we have, in addition to annual, we have seasonal and monthly numbers for those as well. Extreme events, things like hot days, heat index, length and intensity of heat waves, cold days, really heavy precipitation days, degree days, and that's heating and cooling degree days, and then also sea level rise. So each of these climate variables is available for one of 12 regions of the state. The state was kind of broken down into these 12 regions that you see here that pretty closely aligned to the NOAA climate regions. There are a little bit of differences here and there, but they're pretty close. Some data are actually available by station as well. You can see these dots on here that are individual weather stations. Some of them are available by each of those stations, and some are just by the broader region. So the projections on the website are there in a few different ways. We do have a big technical chapter that will really go into a lot of detail on these, but we also have summaries of this chapter for each of the variables listed here. So that'll give you kind of a higher level look at things before you delve into the detailed chapter. In addition to that, we also have the projections themselves. Right now, they are in PDF form in tables, so they're not super easy to use, but they're there. We are working on getting those into a format online that will be easier to use for someone who wants to actually take the raw data and use it in their own modeling. But for the moment, the projections themselves are at least there on the website. As I mentioned, we have a lot of other products available. Each of the technical chapters also has a summary on the website that gives kind of the highlights and an overview of what the sector will experience under climate change. We do have printable 2-page fact sheets for each of those sectors as well. We are hoping to develop regional fact sheets, but we don't have those yet. But we do have regional summaries on the website. So those, for each of those 12 regions I mentioned, these summaries really give some highlights of impacts to each of those regions to kind of drive home to people, you know, what does this mean for me and where I live? How might it affect the region that I live in? We also have case studies that delve into some real world examples of either impacts that have been experienced or adaptation strategies that communities or organizations are working on. We are in the process of developing sort of synthesis products that look at the equity and indigenous issues that I'd really draw from each of the chapters. And there's also an in-depth economic analysis that's also in process. So all of those things and more can be found at the website here. And this is the climate assessment website. So feel free to go there at any time and dig around to see what's there. Hopefully there's some useful information for you. At this point, I will turn it over to Nick to introduce the next speaker.
Thanks, Amanda. That was a great overview, and I appreciate you giving a little bit of explanation of this process. So our next speaker that we have is Dr. Robin Lyshenko. Robin is a professor of geography and dean of social and behavioral sciences at Rutgers University. Her current research explores the economic and equity impacts of climate change with a focus on the northeastern United States. She's currently serving as co-chair for the New York City Panel on Climate Change and co-PI of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, Consortium for Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast. She also served as the co-chair of the Society and Economy Sector Chapter for the New York State Climate Impacts Assessment, which she will be discussing in her presentation. So Robin, I see you have your slides queued up, and I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. I'm hoping folks can hear me okay.
Yep,
Yes?
sounds great.
Awesome.
Yep.
Okay. I am always worried about that. Well, hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I was co-chair of the Society and Economy section, and I'll give you just today a little sense of some of our key findings, an overview to the extent that I can do that in less than 10 minutes. So just, oops, I'm having a little issue with moving my slides. Sorry about that. So the chapter itself looked at projected impacts. It looked at vulnerable populations and communities, and then thought about adaptation and resilience, strategies, opportunities for positive change. We had a set of case studies. I won't have time for everything. I'm really going to give kind of some key highlights on the impacts, some of our key findings, some little tidbits on our case studies. And I just wanted to note that the cross-cutting themes for our work, and I think this really actually permeated through the entire assessment, where I focus and an emphasis on environmental justice and equity, and also to really think in terms of through the lens of indigenous communities and the indigenous communities of our state and the impacts that might occur. So just in terms of our impact areas for this particular chapter, it wasn't the entire society and economy of New York State, which I think would be challenging to write about in one chapter, no matter how long it would be. But we did talk about, so we had sort of a demographic piece thinking about populations and migration. There's about 20 million of us in New York State. We're extremely diverse, among the most diverse states. We have very large immigrant populations. We also have an aging population in New York State, I mean, every place is aging, but our average age is growing older as on average. So we are really thinking in terms of those kinds of lenses with population migration. With the economy, as Amanda said, there is a large-scale economic assessment that's going to be forthcoming. Our particular chapter really kind of keyed in on some very climate-sensitive economic sectors, so tourism, outdoor recreation, natural resources, finance, among the ones that we've really focused on. We also looked at the education sector, which is a sector that hasn't been looked at that much in the past and is, sort of a significant employer in our state. We have about 4 million students from between K through 12 in college. So a really important sector that I think needs a lot more attention in the climate change space. Ditto for cultural arts and historic preservation, another sector that matters a lot for our state. We don't just have, things like MoMA and the Met in New York City, but culture and historic sites all over the state that are very important locally and also vulnerable. And then our state and local government, our governments themselves, they're responsible for planning for adaptation. They're very much sort of leading the way, but also they have their own vulnerabilities. So that was kind of and just in terms of the scoping of the chapter, to give you a sense, and I'll show you the experts who participated at the end, but it was really a terrific and very and a group with very broad expertise. So again, like this isn't kind of a little bit of a nutshell. This is just so in terms of the impacts that we really keyed in on. Extreme events are certainly very significant in New York State. So I'll talk a little bit about those. I'll also talk a little bit about flooding and sea level rise and about temperatures and heat waves and sort of taking those climate stressors and thinking in terms of how they came out on our sectors, again, with just more like, rather than really a lot of detail, more just some, sort of highlights. So in terms of just the economy and extreme events, we're all aware, every one of us who lived through things like Sandy and even Irene before that, and more recently Hurricane Ida a couple of years ago, we know that power outages, disruptions of supply chain, disruptions of energy systems, transportation systems, et cetera, are a significant threat to the economy, to the functioning of the economy. Often maybe short-term impacts, but can be impacts that can be very significant. Communities exposed to events, there's major potential for major property damage, infrastructure losses. So these are things we've all seen, and we're all thinking in terms of, with the possibility of more extreme events, more intense events, the need to really prepare and be ready for what's coming the future wise. In terms of education, school closures also have a significant effect on student performance. And then there's also, when we think about impacts on families, especially on low income families, impacts on rural districts where there may be only one school in a district for like one high school, one middle school, and so forth. So having significant impacts, having significant damage can create, very, real headaches for students, real headaches for families, and real problems. Colleges and universities have those threats, but they've also got student housing that they're sort of trying to protect. They've got research facilities to protect. So, the education sector, again, like a big sector that I think needs really a lot more attention in terms of preparedness and planning. The government itself, again, it's a key element of our planning for climate change, but also operational costs, repair costs. Often those costs are hitting government agencies and hitting the government sector. So just thinking about extreme events, precipitation and sea level rise, sort of connected obviously to extreme events, but coastal flooding, the idea of population displacement, the idea of potential significant increases in insurance costs. We're already seeing, I think I just got a new bill from my insurance company raising my insurance rates. And I think that is just kind of universal and a very significant concern, especially the possibility of insurance withdrawal, which we've seen in other states. And we're not seeing it here yet, but raising a concern. I already mentioned educational impacts, but also just the flat out damage to school buildings, damage to property. significant costs that can be associated with that. There's also the indoor air quality problems that you get with flooding, with mold, and so forth. The culture and historic preservation sector, the many of our small museums and historical sites are actually in flood vulnerable spots throughout the state. And we have I'll mention a case study in a few minutes that looked at that in one particular place. But so those sites are really, they're so critical for the cultural identity of different communities, but also they tend to be on places that have historically or recently flooded, maybe not historically, but more recently have shown to be flood vulnerable. In terms of maintenance costs, flood associated with flooding, decreased tax revenue in coastal counties if property becomes devalued. So significant impacts and concerns there. With respect to a third climate stressor, increasing temperatures, the tourism and recreational sector can be significantly affected. This, for those of you who are skiers or snowmobilers, you can definitely relate to this snow season being just pretty much abysmal. And I think that sort of possibility of significant reductions in snow seasons, changes in the seasonality of recreation is creating a lot of stress and creating and increasingly it may increasingly do so. There's also worker productivity in terms of the economic sectors. There's threat to, especially for outdoor workers, natural resource-based sectors. We didn't do all of them in our chapter because certainly we had like an agriculture chapter and so forth, but just some of them that we keyed in on are spreading of invasive species and that effects on forestry, stress on fisheries, which are also commercial and recreational. Again, back to the education sector with school days and impacts on student learning, student health. In terms of culture and historic preservation, increased costs for museums, increased costs for climate control, just air conditioning, but also climate control generally, having to even, with older buildings having to, do significant HVAC work, which can be really costly. So a lot of sort of significant impacts in our sector to really be thinking about. I don't have time to go through what the case studies were, but I just want to kind of give you a visual. So we had a case study on Hurricane Ida, which was created extreme rainfall in New York, resulted in significant loss of life, actually. So it's, again, a concern. This was first especially hit underserved and migrant populations. Small museums, back to I'm kind of like going around the state a little bit, not in any geographical order, but just trying to get that broader sense of sort of, this was one location, the Walter Elwood Museum. That was a museum that had been flooded and was significantly damaged. Sodas Point, this is a community on a Great Lakes community with increasing rising water levels and so forth, rising and falling water levels, and then sort of needing to adapt to just things that are really kind of outside of expectations, but now increasingly kind of a reality. And then finally, this was an example from Buffalo where it's an existing environmental justice site, which now increasingly is experiencing flooding. And so kind of that multiple stress, that overlap is just another concern really flagged in our case studies. Just kind of jumping really quickly forward into some of our key findings for the state. I've already really emphasized this one about the sort of potential for climate change to really affect nearly every dimension of New York State, significant effects in natural resource sectors, really needing to think in terms of who's affected and really needing to consider sort of those disproportionate impacts. Small businesses, New York State has a larger share of small businesses than a typical state. It's got about 53% of businesses are small businesses, small and rural municipalities, small cultural institutions, frontline workers, outdoor workers, essential public servants, policemen, firemen, teachers, really needing to think about those that suite of folks that are really kind of on the front line in various ways. Another set of folks on the front line are older residents of the state. So just sort of those, as populations age, especially in rural areas where the proportion of the population that's is aging even faster than in urban areas. We need to think about health, mobility, vulnerabilities that put older residents at more risk and really require additional resources, additional attention. So thinking about ways to adapt to climate change amidst an aging population, I think is one of a good takeaway, an important takeaway. Another one, thinking about just the overlap between climate vulnerabilities and other social stresses and other systemic factors. So really flagging low income populations for so many reasons: food insecurity, housing insecurity, and so forth, creating health insecurities, exacerbating stresses from climate change, not so much creating those stresses, but climate change overlapping and exacerbating them. Indigenous populations, people of color, immigrants, unhoused populations living in rural areas. And I even flag us unhoused especially vulnerable, because I think we've had so much attention right now, even in the media, so much attention and so much concern over unhoused populations, and climate change being yet another stressor for those folks. In terms of what we can do, really thinking about and involving local communities in adaptation planning, and invoking principles of environmental justice in all phases. So thinking about inclusion, thinking about hearing community voices, and making climate adaptation decisions with the perspectives of vulnerable populations included in the room, so to speak. Just one more or two more, I guess. Indigenous communities would think about climate change as a threat to resources, practices, heritage sites, things that are very important to Indigenous communities and important to maintaining sort of cultural integrity. They're sort of also, I think, in terms of really thinking about Indigenous communities and their cultural traditions as very critical sources of information about natural hazards, about exposures, about resource management practices. And these can be very much sort of a guide, or a guidepost in terms of our adaptation planning, and really bringing those community voices into adaptation planning and is also another critical takeaway. Finally, just a fifth one. I know I've been kind of a little bit doom and gloom, which I think I always tend to be because of the nature of my work, but really thinking about like that it's not just a doom and gloom report. It's also a report that's really trying to think about ways to channel positive opportunities, sort of balancing the reality of climate change with the possibilities for the opportunities and the possibilities for creating more positive, more equitable futures. So really thinking about ways that the state can move in those directions, incorporating insights from local and state governments, universities, nonprofits, just playing a vital role in climate change awareness, but also really opportunities for innovation. And then thinking about centering equity in the processes, in adaptation processes, and so forth. So it looks like you're popping on because I'm running out of time. Okay. All right. So just some opportunities for positive change. Again, I want to be a little bit more positive. Green jobs as a critical, thing that we're aware of. We're talking about. New York State is certainly on top of, and really moving toward and thinking about as we think about economic impacts. There's opportunities in finance, insurance, and so forth. There's opportunities for using and sort of using the state networks that we have in education, in historic preservation, in the arts, and really using those collaborations and those existing spaces to foster knowledge, to foster adaptation, to sort of promote additional awareness and additional creativity. And then really addressing equity concerns, and especially adapting when thinking about affordable housing, and really thinking about potential for partnerships with community-based organizations to support and implement affordable adaptation measures. So really thinking about not just the negative, but also opportunities and ways to channel positive change. I'm just going to end with a last case study, and I know you didn't get this in my bio, but I'm a passionate cyclist. So this was a case study that I did, and just thinking about as one of the kind of interesting adaptations that we're starting to see is really thinking about cycling, and how as an adaptation to potentially loss of winter sports or reductions or changes in seasonality, things like cycling as an example of new ways of adapting and changing as the climate changes. So I'll just end. I want to make sure to credit the technical working group. Myself and Luis Aguilar Torres, who's at NYSERDA, were the co-chairs that led the chapter, but we had a wonderful set of advisors, a very, sort of with very diverse backgrounds and interests and expertise. So it was really an excellent group to work with, and I thank everyone who contributed. I also need to thank our sector advisors. We got fantastic input. They gave us input on drafts. They gave us input on what to be thinking about, especially in the case studies. So really, this really was a very large collaborative team effort. And I'm grateful for all the work that everyone put in. I think this is just my last slide, I think kind of repeating Amanda's.
Thanks, Robin. Appreciate it. And so just on that point, on the last piece, so a couple people have asked for the link. So the link has been put in the chat, but if people do have clarifying questions as things come up, just encourage people to put things into the chat window, and we're trying to answer those as we go. So our third speaker for today is Janice Barnes. Janice is the founder of Climate Adaptation Partners, which focuses on planning, advocacy, and partnership building for climate adaptation. She's worked on the New York City panel on climate change fourth assessment, National Academy's community-driven relocation in the Gulf study, and the human health and safety sector chapter for the New York Climate Impacts Assessment, which she will be discussing here this afternoon. She has a PhD and a Master of Science from the University of Michigan, go Blue, a Master of Architecture from Tulane University, and a Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Tennessee. So Janice, please take it away. Janice, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think my headset's a little confused about what it's attached to. All right, let's do this. I wanted to thank NYSERDA for bringing all of us together. This is such an important effort for the state of New York. So really appreciate it and appreciate Amanda's leadership all the way through. So health, right? Robin talked a little bit about the hazards that you'll get more detail on when you dig into Columbia's data. When we think about health, sometimes health feels like health care or going to the doctor. And what we're talking about here today is human health and safety in a much more holistic way. And as designers, architects on this call, you know that it's central. You are doing work to create places that safely shelter and inspire people. And we are responsible to the larger natural environment as well. So this is all about the work that we do. Let me just advance the slide here. There we go. So I want to start by thanking the collaborators, one of whom is on the call, Faustinia, glad to see you here. Perry and I co-chaired this, but this was truly a group effort, and a huge shout out to all the contributions and all the guidance that everyone on the team put together. And we also had an extensive body of sector advisors, all of whom provided extraordinarily good advice, as well as critical eye on the content. So thanks to all of those collaborators. The chapter, much like Robin mentioned, has an organizational structure that's important if you're trying to decide where to focus, scanning how the impacts go across the particular sector, the same kinds of foci on equity and climate, etc. So you can see how this is structured and encourage you to take a look through at least at the highlights if you can't get into all of the details. The issue on vulnerability and equity that crosses the entire assessment is very pertinent when it comes to the concerns around human health and safety. So we know that the uneven levels of environmental burdens that fall on those who are experiencing, are experiencing structural racism, have or are living in places of chronic disinvestment, the burdens are higher there. So the exposures may be higher, the impacts may be higher, the resources to cope with those things may be lower. We recognize that the indigenous peoples in our state have very closely tied cultural traditions that connect the natural environment, natural resources that are impacted by climate changes have direct impact on those traditions. When we think about chronic health issues, the folks who are dealing with cardiovascular, respiratory issues, who have some type of disability, have a dependence on a support program like a dialysis center or a home-based medical device, that have greater vulnerability to health risk and face greater stresses in accessing care. That was actually a point that one of our advisors emphasized, thinking about the support transit services and what happens when floodwaters interrupt access to those transit services. So access to care is an issue. And then when we think about disruptions to service, not only the access to care, but the impacts of insurance. So if you have a reduced level of service because of an event that occurs. All of this is to say that some of you in the work that you're doing are likely able to work on the resilience of health facilities, the resilience of transportation systems. The Protect Fund is right behind that, trying to make sure that we have access to our critical pathways. So these are opportunities. They may feel like they're health professional only, but they're for all of us who focus on health in our work and design. So what I'd like to do in the time that I have remaining is to talk specifically about the key findings and how these begin to relate to what we do in design. So when we think about the changes that Robin has raised and think about the other non-climate stressors that are prevalent in our communities, we recognize that there are compounding and cascading impacts. So we just mentioned the lack of access to services. There's also a lack of information. So I think about this in terms of people coming as tourists to, I'm sitting in New Orleans today, coming as tourists to a place where they're not prepared for an event. So if we think about tourism in New York, for example, you could imagine that someone who was in New York when Hurricane Ida hit and did not have awareness of what to do in a situation like that. Or you can imagine a tourist who comes to New York City in the summer and is not aware of the extreme heat issues, urban heat island, what to do. So we really have to think about the multiplicity of ways that we can not only make continuity and access to services and health risk awareness more prevalent, but really think about how we get the information out at a level of consistency, not only for New Yorkers, but for those who are visiting as well. We put a lot of emphasis on public health campaigns, and know that the state had done some work just before COVID started to try to train up, do more work on climate and health integration with our health departments. But there's also work that we could do in the design community, the community planning that you're working on, whatever design project you're touching. You can ask yourself 3 questions. What is the climate where I'm working? What kind of vulnerabilities are coming from that kind of climate? And what can I do about it? And if you center health, if you center well-being in that question that you're asking for, hopefully every single project you're touching right now, there is an opportunity for that kind of planning design effort to help reduce exposures and to also provide resources, ingrained resources in those communities for when exposure can't be necessarily avoided. You have a nearby coping resource to help during the event and then for the recovery after an event. The second issue is one that is pertinent in many ways. The impacts on mental health and overall well-being are pronounced. We know from Eugenia South's work in Philadelphia, for example, that there are heightened incidences of gun violence. We actually had someone from the Penn Urban Health Lab describe a community member who said, "It's hot outside, we're going to have some shootings." So when we think about the role in terms of the mental health issues, the well-being issues that come from climate change related impacts, we recognize that we have to center well-being in the decision-making that we have. We have to recognize mental health as well as the physical health, the physiological, the social that you might think about. There was a gentleman in New Orleans recently who was talking about many of the stressors that are pertinent here. And he said, as an African-American man, I am not ever asked what my mental health is. He's actually started a center in New Orleans to try to address that directly and focus well-being in his community. So when we think about this, one thing that we can think of as a design community is to say, are we considering well-being, mental health specifically, and are we having those conversations with the health service providers in the places where we're working? Do we understand what the community needs and what choices we might be able to make in design decision-making to improve that context? The third issue is the issue of structural racism and ingrained discrimination. It's something that we're all addressing, hopefully more than we had in the past. We're trying very hard to center equity in our decision making. We're trying to be more conscious of the biases that we might individually or collectively carry. And what we have to think about is that any changes that we're making to address climate, we also have to address these ingrained policies or practices that discriminate and contribute to these much longer term issues. So it requires us to look at the places where we're working and ask ourselves about the root causes of the inequities that are there, so that if we're looking at a solution in the context of our profession, if we're looking at a solution, we are actually trying to go to the inclusion of those root causes in the solution making and working with the community, not for the community, not speaking at the community, but working with the community to co-create what the opportunities are to improve the situation and to prioritize based on the community's input how we can collectively choose to draw down those risks. The fourth finding is about a whole of community approach. So this is a term that FEMA had coined a number of years ago, and the way that we interpret this is really crowding in multiple stakeholders, so community, defining communities in the places where we work, recognizing that local health departments and health service providers in the private sector can't do all of this. So if you are making a move that's going to move some dirt or change an existing facility, you are a part of the solution making, but it's also really crowding in this much broader array of voices to say, what are the issues related to public health and climate change in the place where I'm working? How do we work with community members to identify existing resources, opportunities, assets within the community to help raise up awareness of the public health and climate change issues, the contribution, the valuing of qualitative local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge on peer with what we normalize as technical expertise. So once we do that and involve the whole of community, we can involve the whole of community in the solution making. And then lastly, we have to think about this in terms of its sustainment. When COVID hit, none of us were really prepared. And while we may have a better handle on COVID, pandemic preparedness and the data on those projections are pretty eye-opening. So we have to think about all the work that we can do to tighten these relationships up so that as we face other challenges, we don't push climate and health to the wayside. So raising awareness, thinking about every design decision that you're making with additional health benefits, and making sure that climate change is included in every decision that you're making. Are you climate aware? Are you thinking about vulnerabilities? And are you having those conversations about how to draw down the associated risk? The last thing I would say is it's heat season. So pay attention to what's happening in the state in terms of extreme heat. Think about that now. And to quote an old friend, we can't unknow this. So please keep this in mind in your design work.
Thanks, Janice. We definitely, I think I know who your friend is. We definitely can't unknow this. And that's why it's important to have these discussions and to think about exactly what you said about incorporating it into design. So last but certainly not least, we have a presentation from Dr. Carrie Brown. Carrie's a director at Resource Refocus, who specializes in decarbonization and resiliency from the lens of policy research, program design, evaluation, codes and standards, and other technical consulting. She's very active in ASHRAE in the International Building Performance Simulation Association, where she's immediate past president and will join the ASHRAE board as a director at large for the upcoming society year. She holds a PhD in building technology from MIT, an MS from UC Berkeley, and a Bachelor of Science from MIT. I also just want to add that Carrie is one of the main reasons why we have a strong building sector chapter. I very much enjoyed the opportunity to work with her on this assessment, and I'm excited to hear what she has to say about it. So, Carrie, you're up.
Great, thanks, Nick. So I also want to start off with just saying that we had a really strong technical work group. Nick was my co-chair, absolutely amazing to work with him. Ilya is on the call, he was also part of our team. But we just had a really wonderful, diverse background. I also want to specifically flag 2 of Nick's students, Bethany Greenaway and Megan Holton. They were instrumental in getting this across the finish line. And then parallel to the others, we had a lot of sector advisors who gave us really thorough reviews and made our chapter better. So going through the results. As Amanda mentioned, there wasn't a buildings chapter in the original climate, so there is a little bit more introduction in this section. Starts out with the overall scope, talks about equity and climate, and then goes into the actual impacts, vulnerable populations and systems, and then some of the actual strategies. So first major impact, echoing a lot of what you heard in the other presentations, increasing temperatures a major concern. This is both on the average annual and extreme events. And we're especially worried about this with urban heat islands because this will compound the effects of the heat waves. As architects, I think you're familiar that a lot of these passive design decisions can really affect the impact of heat on buildings. So really thinking through the orientation, natural ventilation, things like that can help mitigate the overheating risks. And, we're worried about the people in the buildings for overheating first and foremost, but also it has impacts on the buildings. It can, damage the HVAC systems when they're operating out of their expected range, and it can also make some of the building materials less durable. Changes in precipitation, we're expecting increase in frequency, intensity, and amount of heavy precipitation. This is likely, having floodwater issues. This can get into mechanical systems. It can bring debris into buildings. We also have concerns on chemical contamination. Sea level rise. We're expecting to see about 2 to 3 feet rise in the United States coastal coastline in the tidal Hudson. One of the things that might not be thinking about, but as you have changes in the distance to the ocean, we have effects on the water table, which means that you can have increased salinity, which in turn can have issues in your foundation or other support systems like your sewers. And then similar to the flooding, we can see general structural issues, electrical issues, getting debris into the buildings. Sorry about that, I had too many. Extreme events, we're expecting to see an increase in extreme events. We're having concerns about erosion, storm surge, flooding, high winds, and these can really impact and compound the effects of the other hazards that we're seeing. Vulnerability and equity concerns. This is, a lot of what we were hearing from the other speakers, but people of color, Indigenous peoples, and low-income individuals and families are more likely to live in the communities with buildings that have greater exposure to climate hazards. These are often referred to as frontline communities. And within these communities, we're especially concerned about adults over 65, children, and the chronically ill. Many of the frontline communities don't have access to capital to implement adaptation and resilience strategies. The communities are often living in buildings that have historic lack of investment in maintenance. And frontline communities often don't have the ability to move somewhere else when a retrofit is happening. So they're really vulnerable to anything that would cause displacement. Key finding number 1, buildings of all ages, functions, and locations across New York State are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Said another way, if you are affiliated with a building in New York in some way, you're going to be affected. So what are the things that we can do now? Property owners of both existing buildings and new construction can learn about the hazard risks that are in, their property's area and start thinking about implementing resiliency strategies to address both the current and the future risks. Key finding number 2, given the long lifespan of buildings, new construction and retrofits that consider long-term climate projections will better address future climate risks. So here we need to really think about the component parts of the building. Your envelope will last for decades and decades, but your HVAC, your domestic hot water systems are, 15 to 20 years, depending on your building type. And so as you're designing these or doing retrofits, we really need to think about what will that system see in its lifespan? So what can we do? Focusing on adaptation measures for the lifespan of those systems. And also, on one hand, for envelopes, I think anyone who's done an envelope retrofit knows that it's a lot easier just to do it right the first time. And so I think it's really important to prioritize envelopes in the initial design. On the flip side, for your systems, which have shorter lifespans, when you're replacing them, this is a great time to think about adaptation strategies. Key finding 3, climate impacts to buildings can ripple to many different parts of the community. So as we heard with the other speakers, the buildings are really integrated and interdependent with all of the other sectors. As you have damage to the buildings, this can, ripple through the community. And we're especially concerned about damage to essential facilities. So thinking about schools, community centers, hospitals, it's really important that we have, resilient designs that will be able to stay through extreme events. So what can we do? Really focusing on measures like flood and wind protection, also thinking about backup power to make sure that our critical facilities will be able to help us through the climate hazards and serve the communities. Key finding 4, communities of color, tribal communities, and low-income communities are more likely to congregate, live, and work in buildings that have greater exposure to climate hazards. So as we said before, homes and buildings that are in these frontline communities, they're both more susceptible to the climate impacts. There's a historic lack of investment, so they are living in buildings that are very much so in need of retrofit. These communities are really vulnerable to climate-driven weather impacts. What can we do? So first of all, just really focusing on improving the quality and standard of buildings in the frontline communities so that we're building affordable, resilient buildings. As we do this, we have the opportunity to reduce energy costs for the residents, also to create safer, healthier buildings. And these efforts can really help us to address longstanding inequities. Key finding 5, individual adaptation and resilience strategies can address multiple climate impacts. So as we're thinking about greenhouse gas reduction, resilience, adaptation, these are inherently intertwined. And if you are designing in a well-selected way, they can all be beneficial to one another. Conversely, if you're only focusing on greenhouse gas reductions, you can have maladaptive decisions now that are not going to perform well in the long term. So what can we do? Building owners can explore opportunities to help their buildings become more resilient. Policymakers can incorporate locally important climate resilience strategies into their codes and standards. What are some opportunities for positive change? Regenerative design is an area that a lot of our teammates on the working group are really focusing on. And here, instead of just trying to minimize doing harm to the surrounding area, this is really focusing on creating spaces that connect occupants to nature and actively improve the condition of the surrounding environment. Strategies with co-benefits of greenhouse gas reduction and climate adaptation. So one example is on-site renewables and energy storage. This is a greenhouse gas reduction. At the same time, it's a really resilient strategy when you're having power outages. Green roofs are another example. And then finally, building technology advancements. Building performance simulation, this is where I live, so I think it's important. And really looking at some of the new building management systems and starting to think about how to integrate with smart microgrids. You've seen the links in the chat, but I encourage you to explore the chapter in more detail, and we would be happy to take questions after you've read it in more detail. Okay, thank you.
You're on mute, Nick.
There we go. Doing great. Okay, so we're now going to turn to a Q&A session. While many folks may need to run as we get to 1 o'clock, most of our speakers are able to stay a little bit on the call to answer some of your questions. And joining us, and I invite Robin and Janice if they want to turn their video on. Joining us is Ilya Azaroff. He is a fellow of the AIA and a professor in practice at New York City College of Technology. He's also the founding principal of Plus Lab Architect PLLC. He really is an internationally recognized leader in disaster mitigation, resilient planning, and regenerative design strategies. As just one example from his CV, he's part of Resilient 21, which is a coalition currently advising the White House on resilient strategies. So, Ilya, thanks for joining us for the Q&A part this afternoon. While I'm waiting for other questions, and if people have questions there, feel free to put them in the chat window. I'm going to throw out a non-softball question to start this off. And the question I wanted to ask is, there's a lot of conversations for architects around the standard of care, which refers to the level of skill, expertise, and diligence that's expected from architects and architectural firms. It also represents some of the accepted professional practices and responsibilities that we're expected to adhere to when we provide services to a client. To quote Janice, now that we can't unknow some of these things related to climate change, and many of these things are not actually covered in the code, how does this knowledge potentially impact how we work in our profession as architects?
Nick, I don't mind taking that on. The standard of care, to that excellent point Janice made, once you've learned what you see here in front of you, you must respond to those through design, and you will be held accountable because the standard of care for all architects must meet those standards of health, safety, and welfare. And it's not a mistake that the American Bar Association in 2018 put this topic as front and center for their national organization's convention when they got together. And it's about how professional services are being delivered and evaluating resilient strategies. But if we get to our ethos of health, safety, and welfare, it is a natural that we can be the change we need to see in our communities. And through better design, understanding the science that goes into it helps us enormously. It's going to go beyond code in most cases, and in some cases with New York State, as we're advancing through NYSERDA and the code cycle, there's catching up. But we should always be looking at this data to design for tomorrow. And the last point of that is we are designing for tomorrow. Your buildings are not these static elements, and so that the projection of the climate towards the future really needs to hit your life cycle and beyond, because those buildings are going to be here for 100 years, hopefully, or more. So think about that projection. That is your minimum standard of care going forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Elliot. Others, did you have thoughts about that? Carrie, I see you unmuted yourself, so.
I was just gonna say I just absolutely echo what Ilya said. I don't think I can answer it better than he did.
Okay. So some questions are starting to come in. Is there any advice from this group for people who, it's great that New York State has this resource, but many other states don't have similar information. What is the reliable information that you might turn to if you're working on projects in other states or perhaps in other countries?
I think the National Climate Assessment at the moment is probably the best resource at the moment, and I did put that link in the chat there as well.
Thanks, Amanda.
Globally, you should look at the IPCC report and the links and depth of elements that are in the IPCC report. Then you can drill down into the nations that have commitments and look at those commitments specifically for the nations that have signed on, which is just about everyone. A lot of great information there.
Not a lot of other questions are coming in. Janice, you added the Climate Resilience Toolkit. Did you want to say something about that?
I would just say the USCRT has a host of tools that designers can readily use. You can search, you can go to Climate Explorer and search by zip code to get your historic record as well as projections on extreme heat, on temperature rather. which will show you categorically like days over 90, days over 95, days over 100 compared to the historic models and the accuracy of the models to the observed temperatures. And similarly for precipitation and different precipitation levels and summaries by region. So that is an excellent, easy to use resource with everything publicly available in plain language summary.
Thanks, Janice.
And
So
the one thing I would add for anyone who's doing building performance simulation, the national labs are starting to release future weather files that are, highly vetted, highly researched resources that you can use.
Thanks, Carrie. So we are at 1 o'clock. Mike or Cassidy, I don't know if you had any last comments just about the survey or things that people need to know.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all so much for being here today. I am putting the CE evaluation in the chat right now. Should have just popped up. If you can't for some reason click on it now, it will be emailed to you afterwards. So thank you all for your time today and have a great day.